Her own father called her ugly and traded her like garbage, but the cowboy she was given to, he changed her life forever. Stick around to hear the full story. It's not what you think. And if it hits you like it hit me, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more raw, real stories like this. Best be rid of this ugly girl. Ain't worth the food she eats, her father said flatly, like he was throwing out spoiled meat, not his own flesh and blood. Clara didn't cry, not because she didn't want to, but because there was nothing left in her to cry with. Shame had hollowed her out years ago. She stood there, hands clenched at her sides, head bowed low, wishing she could disappear into the dirt beneath her feet. Her dress hung loose on her bony frame, filthy and worn thin. Her hair, unwashed and tangled, clung to her face, hiding the crooked nose and hollow cheeks that folks never let her forget. They spoke around her like she was a sack of potatoes, something to be dealt with, not acknowledged. No one asked her name. No one cared. And in that moment, Clara wasn't a daughter. She wasn't even a girl. She was a mistake that had lived too long, a burden they were finally free of. The cowboy, broad-shouldered, sun-worn, and silent, just gave a small nod before tossing a worn bundle of fur pelts and old horseshoes down in the dust. That was the deal. Clara didn't know what kind of customs cowboys followed out here in the western frontier, but this wasn't a kidnapping. It was a handoff. She was something broken, passed off like junk no one wanted, and rejection like that carves its own scar deep into a girl's chest. She braced for cruelty, a sharp yank or harsh command, but instead the cowboy just held out a blanket and motioned toward his horse, his movements strangely gentle. He rode ahead as they started out, never glancing back. Clara trailed behind, caught in a haze of bitter thoughts. Her father's disgust, townsfolk whispering about her behind her back, children snickering at the sight of her hunched shoulders and sickly skin. But mile after mile into the dry wilderness, something unfamiliar began to rise inside her. It wasn't exactly fear, and it sure wasn't hope. It was more like a sharp clarity that she'd finally left behind every single soul who'd ever made her feel unworthy of love. By the time they reached a quiet patch of land by a creek, the sun dipping low behind the hills, the cowboy stopped. He climbed down, turned to her, and looked. Not through her, not around her, but right at her. And that quiet look unsettled her more than any blow could have. Clara stood there gripping the blanket and whispered, "Why didn't you say anything?" He didn't answer, but dropped to one knee and started building a fire, not to threaten, not to assert control, but just to keep her warm. And somewhere deep inside her, in a place that had been locked away and frozen for far too long, something small stirred. She had prepared herself for barking commands and rough handling. Instead, she awoke to the smell of roasted corn and the soft murmur of water nearby. Pulling the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders, she spotted the cowboy down by the creek, calmly washing a strip of deer meat. His movements were steady and unhurried. He looked up, caught her eyes, and gave her a nod. It wasn't an order, wasn't a dismissal, just a quiet, simple recognition. And that single act of acknowledgement felt so alien to her, she had to look away, embarrassed by the way her heart thudded at even the smallest show of kindness. Back home, even her younger brothers took pleasure in mocking her, calling her crow face when their mother wasn't listening. And now, here she was beside a man folks back home would call a savage, but he'd never once lifted a hand to her or raised his voice. As they traveled deeper into the wild hills, Clara started to notice how other people looked at him when they passed through tiny settlements, some with deference, some with wariness. He wasn't just some drifting cowboy. He held weight the kind people noticed. They rarely spoke, mostly just exchanged glances or quiet gestures. But his silence wasn't cruel, it was patient. When she slipped, trying to cross a narrow stream, he caught her by the elbow, steadying her with a firm, careful grip. She blinked hard, choking back a sob, not because of pain, but because that touch, so gentle, felt utterly foreign. That night, he handed her a small woven pouch filled with herbs and motioned for her to tuck it beneath her bedding. When she looked puzzled, he leaned close and said softly, "Dream good," in halting English. That tiny act, so small and unexpected, cracked something wide open inside her. For the first time since her mama passed, Clara let the tears come. Not because she'd been tossed aside again, but because this man, a stranger with nothing to gain, was treating her like she meant something. She didn't quite know what she was to him. Not a wife, not the way her people would say, and certainly not a servant. Lying under the open sky, stars blinking down over the canyon ridge, she wondered what kind of man would take in a girl no one wanted, ask for nothing in return, and yet look at her like she wasn't some cast-off, and why, in his quiet company, she felt more visible than she ever had back in town. As spring settled in and the trail got rougher, Clara's footing grew more sure. By the end of that first week, she no longer stumbled along behind the cowboy. She walked beside him, sometimes close enough to catch the scent of smoke and saddle leather clinging to his shirt, sometimes lagging just enough to watch the way he moved through the land like he belonged to it. She didn't say much, wasn't sure if she should, but he'd started pointing out wild herbs, naming critters in that low, slow voice of his, showing her which berries to leave alone. One afternoon, as they rode past a ridge streaked red with dust, a young man appeared on horseback. He was scrappy, cocky, and armed with a bow slung low across his back. Clara didn't catch the whole exchange, but the boy's smirk said enough. He looked her over, then shot some slick remark at the cowboy that didn't need translating. When he let out a sharp, mocking laugh and rode off, Clara's stomach twisted. But the cowboy didn't react, didn't speak. He just stood still for a second, jaw tight, then turned and kept walking like it didn't touch him. Later that night, they camped under a stone ledge. Clara sat near the fire blanket, pulled tight, and finally asked, "Do they think I'm some kind of punishment?" Her voice cracked on the last word. The cowboy looked at her for a long while, then reached into his weathered saddlebag and pulled out a small carved wooden comb. He placed it in her hands. "My mama made this for the woman I'd marry one day," he said slowly, his words thick with accent but steady. "But she passed before I ever got the chance." Clara stared at the comb, its smooth shape resting in her palm like it had been waiting all this time. Her throat tightened, something bitter and old splintering inside her. "You could have turned me away," she whispered without looking up. But he answered soft and sure. "Your eyes were sad. I don't walk away from sadness." That night, as she ran the comb through her tangled hair beside the firelight, Clara didn't feel beautiful, not yet. But she started to wonder if being unwanted had never been about looks at all. Maybe no one had ever seen her right, until now. The first time Clara laughed, it startled them both. She'd tripped over a root while gathering firewood, sprawling face first into a patch of pine needles. When she looked up and saw the cowboy, trying not to grin the ridiculousness of it all, the traded girl in the middle of nowhere, twigs in her hair, and him so quiet and unreadable, just broke out of her in one bright, clean laugh that rang through the trees. He blinked at her for a second, and then slowly he laughed too. Not loud, not long, but real. And something shifted again between them. In the days after that, the silence they shared took on a different shape, easier, like it belonged there. Clara began copying his hand signs for things like water and fire food and sleep. And each time she got one right, she felt a flicker of pride spark inside her. One evening, as she helped him clean a rabbit he'd trapped, he watched her work and said, "You ain't weak." It wasn't a compliment in the way people usually meant it, but it landed deeper than anything sweet ever could. Still, peace out here didn't last long. The very next day, they came across a tiny settlement tucked into a bend of canyon. A handful of cabins, some goat smoke curling from low chimneys. The women watched from behind their shawls, whispering as they passed. An older man stepped forward, sharp-eyed and stiff-backed, speaking to the cowboy in clipped cutting tones. Clara stayed behind, unsure, but she could feel the judgment in every glance. The elder looked at her like she was filth. Then he spat on the dirt near her feet. Clara flinched, her body folding in on itself from years of knowing just how small to make herself. She expected the cowboy to stay quiet like always, but instead, he stepped between them, shoulders squared, and spoke clear, hard, not loud, but impossible to ignore. The elder backed off. Whatever words were said, they worked. He hadn't defended her like a burden. He'd stood his ground like she was something that mattered. That night, camped at the edge of the canyon town, Clara sat by the fire, voice small as she asked, "Why do you keep doing that? Standing up for me?" He didn't answer right away, just poked at the embers with a stick, eyes distant. Then finally he said, "'Cause no one stood for my sister, and it broke her." Clara looked at him, really looked, and something clicked. They were both cast-offs, fragments of people no one had wanted yet out here under the open sky. Their broken pieces were beginning to align. They left the settlement just as dawn crept over the hills, the smoke from the night's fire still clinging to Clara's clothes like a shadow she couldn't shake. But the cowboy walked ahead, steady as ever, his silence no longer distant but thoughtful, measured. For the first time, Clara didn't feel like a burden trailing behind. She felt like part of the journey. She carried her own gear, knew how to set a snare, and could even recognize the high call of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. And the cowboy, still a man of few words, had started glancing her way in moments that made her chest go tight. Not with fear, with something far more fragile, hope. The kind you don't know what to do with because it's so unfamiliar it feels dangerous. But that thread between them strained when they came upon a wrecked settler's wagon at the base of a ridge. The wheels had shattered, one horse lay dead in its harness, the other limping and wide-eyed, soaked in sweat and fear. Clara's breath caught when she spotted the woman, blonde, pale, covered in bruises, clutching a bloody rifle and mumbling prayers. The cowboy moved slowly toward her, arms low and non-threatening, but the woman shrieked, raised the gun with trembling hands, and screamed, "Don't touch me, savage," before falling apart in sobs. Clara stepped in her hands, up, voice soft. "He's not going to hurt you, I swear." But the woman's blue eyes locked on her, and what Clara saw there wasn't gratitude. It was betrayal. "You're with him," the woman spat, like Clara had turned into something shameful just by standing at his side. Still, they helped her. The cowboy cleaned her wounds while Clara calmed the frightened horse, whispering to it until it stopped trembling. By nightfall, the woman, her name was Ruth, had stopped recoiling every time the cowboy moved, though her eyes still lingered on him with unease. That evening, Clara sat alone near the fire, her chest tight with an old shame that hadn't surfaced since her father's house. That cruel little voice inside her whispered that no matter how gentle he was, the world would always see him as a monster, and by walking beside him, they'd see her as one too. Later, she found the courage to ask him, Why didn't you just leave her? He didn't meet her eyes, just said, because she's alone. You remember what that feels like. And Clara did. Too well. But something inside her shifted because choosing to stay by this man's side meant living by a different kind of code. Not the kind written in town laws or shouted from pulpits, but the kind built in silence in actions done when no one else was watching. The next morning, Clara was down by the rocks gathering water when she heard hushed voices. Ruth's voice came sharp through the cool air, thick with panic. You don't understand, he's Apache. They kill folks like us. Clara froze, the weight of those words slamming into her like a stone. She stepped into view. He saved you, she said, her voice steady, even though her hands trembled. He's treated us both better than most white men ever have. Ruth flinched, caught off guard, but she didn't back down. You weren't raised out here, she hissed. You don't know what they've done. Clara stared at her pain flickering behind her eyes. She didn't have to dig deep for the memories. Her father's revulsion, her stepmother's cruelty, the children who laughed and pointed like she was something ugly. No, she said quietly. But I know what people do when they think you're beneath them. Later, when they set out toward an army outpost Ruth claimed was nearby, Clara kept her distance from the cowboy not out of fear of him, but from the guilt that came from still caring what others might think. By midday, they reached the ridge Ruth had spoken of. Below them, scattered across the prairie like a scar, was a makeshift cavalry outpost. Fences, half-built tents billowing in the wind, smoke curling from a cook fire. Clara's stomach twisted. She'd once dreamed of places like this where things were orderly, safe, and someone was always in charge. But now it all felt unfamiliar. Ruth was quickly ushered in, soldiers running up with stretchers and questions. They looked Clara over, too, their gazes snagging on her worn dress and dust-smudged face. But when their eyes found the cowboy, everything turned cold. Step back, savage, one of them barked. Clara moved forward, mouth opening to explain, but another soldier grabbed her arm. We'll get you home, miss. Don't worry, we'll deal with him. The cowboy didn't struggle. He didn't speak. Even as they forced him down and tied his wrists, he stayed quiet. Clara's voice rang out desperate. Stop it! He's with me. But no one listened. The world that had always overlooked her had finally taken notice. But all they wanted was to shove her back into the same box she'd spent her whole life trying to break free from. As they hauled the cowboy toward a canvas-holding tent, his eyes found Clara's, not broken, not pleading. Just steady calm, the same quiet strength he'd carried since the first night they met. And in that gaze, Clara understood if she didn't stand up for him now, she'd be no different than the father who'd traded her off like unwanted livestock. She burst into the captain's tent, boots caked in dust fury burning hot in her throat. Her fists balled at her sides as she snapped, "Why are you holding him?" The captain, a weathered man with a slack jaw and the smell of cheap whiskey rolling off him, barely looked up. "'Cause he's an Injun, miss. And around here, that's all the reason we need." Clara felt the blood drain from her face, her stomach twisting not from fear, but pure rage. She slammed her palm against his desk hard enough to rattle the tin cup beside his papers. That man saved Ruth's life. He saved mine. He's not a criminal. The captain didn't blink. He just leaned back in his chair with a smirk and said, "Maybe not, but we can't have him wandering around scaring the women folk now, can we?" That one smug line snapped something in her clean in two. Clara stormed out before she said something she couldn't take back. Her pulse thudding hard as she found Ruth sitting by the fire pit, bandaged clean, sipping tea like nothing was wrong. "Say something," Clara said, her voice sharp with disbelief. Ruth didn't meet her eyes. "It's better this way," she muttered. You'll be safe now." Clara stared at her stunned. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You were never the one in danger." That night, Clara found the cowboy kneeling in the holding tent, wrists bound, bruises darkening along his jaw, but his gaze calm, steady, the same as ever. She dropped beside him, voice shaking. "I'm sorry. I never should have brought you here." He gave the smallest shake of his head. "You needed to see." And she had. She saw it clearly now that the world she once hoped might save her only wanted to tame her, to quiet her, to turn her into something obedient and thankful. Thankful to men who only measured her worth by how easily she bent. She leaned forward, pressed her forehead to his tears, sliding down her cheeks, and made her choice. Not just to help him escape, but to walk away from every lie she'd ever been told about who deserved love, who deserved freedom. As stars blinked above the prairie sky, she whispered, "I won't let them keep you," and felt him exhale like a man who'd been holding his breath for far too long. She waited until the camp quieted, the soldiers drunk on self-righteousness and victory, their rifles slipping in lazy grips as they dozed near the fire. Then she moved like someone with nothing left to lose, every step driven by the beat of her heart. At the supply shed she'd seen earlier, she found a rusted hatchet, a coil of rope, and a pair of bolt cutters carelessly left behind by some half-sober quartermaster. Slipping them beneath her shawl, she didn't feel like a girl who'd been rescued or a criminal's accomplice. She felt like herself, fully, fiercely, for the first time. Inside the tent, she knelt beside him. He didn't speak, just watched her with that same knowing look. When she snapped the chain from his wrists, he whispered, "If we run, they'll follow." She shook her head. "Then let 'em. We'll show them what real strength looks like." They moved fast, keeping low through the brush, her smaller frame darting ahead to scout the path while he, bruised but unbroken, followed close behind. He led them east toward a canyon he said the cavalry wouldn't dare enter. By sunrise, the jagged cliffs came into view, rising from the prairie like stone guardians. Clara dropped to her knees, breath ragged not from the run, but from the weight of what she'd left behind. "They'll call me a traitor," she whispered. The cowboy knelt beside her, brushed a strand of hair from her dirt-smudged face, and said, "Only people afraid of the truth say things like that." They kept going for 3 more days, sleeping beneath the ledges of dry ravines, eating what little game he could trap, drinking from hidden streams. Her feet blistered, her body ached, but never, not once did Clara think about turning back. By the 4th morning, they reached a hidden meadow tucked beside a clear running stream, where an old woman sat stirring a pot over a small fire, her face lined by age but softened by kindness. "My aunt, the cowboy," explained quietly. "She used to be a healer." The woman didn't seem surprised to see Clara. She looked at her like she'd been waiting all along and said in gentle, accented English, "You weren't traded. You were found." That evening, seated around the fire's glow, its warmth chasing off the edge of fear still clinging to her, Clara looked at the cowboy, truly looked, and something settled in her chest. It wasn't gratitude, and it wasn't desperation. It was love, plain and terrifying. Because somehow, in his steady, quiet, and unflinching strength, he had taught her something no one else had, that worth isn't given by others. It's claimed. But the cavalry hadn't forgotten. Especially men like Captain Marsh, who saw challenge in any woman who didn't bow and treason in any man who didn't know his place, especially if he wasn't white. 2 weeks later, they came armed not with justice, but revenge dressed as law. Clara spotted them first from the rocky bluff overlooking the clearing, 5 mounted soldiers' rifles glinting under the afternoon sun. Ruth rode among them, her arm in a sling, her face drawn tight with silence. Clara turned and sprinted back to the fire where the cowboy and his aunt were sorting dried herbs. "They're here," she gasped, 5 riders maybe more close behind. He rose slowly, not with fear, but with a tired steadiness, like he'd always known this moment would come. "Take my aunt," he said. "There's a place in the ravine, hollow stones. You'll be safe there." But Clara grabbed his arm, eyes blazing. "I'm not running. If they take you, they'll have to take me too." He looked at her, something heavy in his expression, and whispered, "You shouldn't die for me." She shook her head. "You still don't get it. I'm not dying for you. I'm living for what you showed me." It happened just as sunlight struck the clearing, turning the air gold. Captain Marsh leveled his rifle, and Ruth's voice rose weak but urgent. "Let the girl go. We can still help her." But Clara stepped out first, hands raised high, voice ringing with fire. "He's not your prisoner. He's my husband." The words stopped the world. They'd never spoken vows, never shared a kiss, but truth doesn't wait for ceremony. It just is. And in that moment it was more real than anything carved in a church wall. The soldiers froze, confused. The cowboy stepped up beside her, standing tall, solid as the ground beneath their feet. "You don't get to tell me who I belong to," Clara said, her voice breaking but bold. "Not you, not my father, not some uniform. He gave me back my life because he saw more than what the world said I was worth." Silence fell over the clearing. Then from the back, a younger soldier muttered, "Let 'em be, sir. They ain't hurting no one." Ruth looked away, shame blooming across her face. The captain's jaw clenched. He spit into the dirt and growled, "This ain't over." Then he turned his horse, the rest following in his wake. Clara didn't move until the dust settled. Then she turned to the cowboy, her hand reaching for his. In that moment, they weren't fugitives. They weren't outlaws. They were simply 2 people who'd stood against the world and won. She looked up at him, then the firelight catching in her eyes, and for the first time since all this began, she realized something simple, almost absurd. "I never even asked your name," she said, voice soft with wonder and a hint of a smile. He raised an eyebrow, a ghost of amusement flickering across his face. "You never needed it," he replied. But she held his gaze, her fingers curling tighter around his. "I want it now," she whispered like a promise, not a question. He was quiet for a beat, then said, "Jessie." She repeated it slow, like she was learning the shape of something sacred. "Jessie," she said again, then gave a small nod, like something inside her had just clicked into place. "It suits you." And Jesse, the man who had never asked for anything, only nodded once and said, "Clara." Like her name too had weight, like it finally meant something worth carrying. Clara stepped closer until there was no more distance to close. She pressed her forehead to his, their noses brushing eyes closed. Her fingers found the hem of his worn coat, clutching it like an anchor. His hands rested at her waist, steady, like they'd always belonged there. "I never thought I'd feel safe in someone's arms," she murmured. "You're not just safe," Jessie said quietly. "You're home." They stood like that, swaying slightly, the wind whispering through the canyon trees, the fire cracking behind them. He kissed her, then not rushed, not wild but slow, certain, and with the kind of care only someone who'd been gentle, even when the world hadn't been, could offer. And when their foreheads met again, Clara smiled through the tears she didn't bother to wipe away. "Where do we go now?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Jesse looked out toward the mountains, his thumb brushing across the back of her hand. Wherever we want. And as the moon climbed higher and the creek murmured its quiet song, Clara leaned into his chest, eyes drifting closed, knowing nothing ahead would be easy, but for the first time in her life, she wouldn't be facing it alone. The seasons shifted. With each sunrise in that quiet canyon, Clara let go of the girl she used to be, the one who flinched at reflections, who bit her tongue, who thought love had to be earned through pleasing men who'd never loved her back. Under the calm steadiness of the cowboy and the gentle guidance of his aunt, she learned how to heal with herbs, weave fishing nets, follow elk tracks, and read the wind like it was a language. She didn't do it because she had to. She did it because she wanted to belong. And belonging here didn't mean becoming someone new. It meant finally recognizing who she'd always been. They never talked about marriage again, but they planted corn side by side. They told stories by firelight. And when Clara touched his face, it was with a reverence that needed no vows. Once catching her reflection in the stream, she saw herself sunburned, calloused hands, wild hair, and for the first time, she didn't turn away. She saw strength, defiance, a kind of beauty no town would ever understand. Travelers came now and then, distant cousins, traders, even a lone priest who nodded kindly but asked no questions. Stories about their stand spread in whispers, not as shame, but legend. Some called her crazy. Some called her brave. Clara didn't care. She hadn't chosen him to prove anything to the world, only to herself. And in his arms, she found a truth that no sermon, no law, no bloodline had ever offered her. To be loved without conditions was the rarest thing in this life. When word came that her father had died bitter alone and unloved, Clara didn't feel joy, just release, like the exhale after a breath held too long. She marked the day not with mourning, but by planting wildflowers near the stream, not for him, but for the girl she once was, the girl he couldn't break no matter how hard he tried. And as she watched the petals dance in the wind, Jess came up behind her, wrapping her in the same old blanket he'd offered her that first night by the fire. He whispered, "No one's ever gonna give you away again." Clara leaned into him, eyes closed, and smiled. Not because everything was fixed, but because the parts that mattered had grown back stronger, rooted in something real, and finally, completely hers. And that's the story, friends. You know, when I first started writing Clara and Jesse's journey, I didn't expect it to break me the way it did. But this isn't just a story about the Wild West or about running from the law. It's about what happens when two broken souls who've been tossed aside, belittled, and written off find something in each other the world never gave them: dignity, tenderness, and a place to belong. Clara starts off as someone who believes she's unlovable because that's what the people closest to her told her. But Jesse, in his quiet strength, doesn't try to fix her. He simply sees her. And that's the most powerful kind of love there is. Jesse, on the other hand, is a man of few words, carrying the weight of history, silence, and loss. He doesn't fight with fists. He fights with presence, with patience, with action. And through him, Clara learns that her worth was never something to be earned. It was always hers. To me, this story is a reminder that we are not what others say we are. We are not our scars. We are not our past. We are who we choose to become when someone finally looks at us and says, "I see you." If this story touched you even a little, please let me know in the comments. What part hit you the hardest? Who did you relate to more, Clara or Jesse? And if you believe in love that doesn't ask for perfection but offers presence, Maybe this story was meant for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. Until next time, take care and be kind to each other. You never know who's carrying a weight they've never spoken aloud.